J.K. Rowling just went from decrying the banning of books to denying the Nazis' burning of books. Let's talk about how she sunk so low. If you've heard of Joanne Rowling, it's likely for one of two things: writing the children's series Harry Potter, or being a rabid, foaming-at-the-mouth billionaire who spends her days wandering around her castle ranting about trans people on Twitter. Think Scrooge, but with less empathy or self-awareness. I'm not going to discuss the last half a decade of her vilifying, demonizing, and slandering trans people because there's plenty of information about that out there. I mentioned quite a lot of that in this video on her podcast, The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling. So here's what happened. On Wednesday, March 13th, which is yesterday for me, Joanne Rowling posted a tweet with a screenshot that read,
"The Nazis burned books on trans healthcare and research. Why are you so desperate to uphold their ideology around gender?"
To which Joanne responded,
How? How did you type this out and press send without thinking, I should maybe check my source for this because it might have been a fever dream?
This tweet was referencing the significant, undisputed evidence that Nazis burned Magnus Hirschfeld's research on early trans healthcare. Or at least, it's undisputed by Holocaust historians and scholars. The article in the Holocaust Encyclopedia, produced by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, gives an impressive account of Hirschfeld's life and career. And I'll be quoting their work as to avoid undue accusations of editorializing. Although it's possible that Nazis, staunch Holocaust denialists, and J.K. Rowling will disagree. I can't speak to any overlap between these three groups, but obviously you're free to come to your own conclusions. Magnus Hirschfeld has a complicated legacy.
During the Weimar Republic, Hirschfeld became especially prominent. The Nazi Party rejected these new ideas about gender and sexuality. While many Germans embraced Hirschfeld's work, others found it scandalous. His work was frequently attacked in the press. Large numbers of Germans were opposed to public discussions of sex and sexuality. They viewed such debates as decadent, overly permissive, and immoral. Many were disturbed by the increased visibility of sex in advertising, film, and other aspects of daily life in the Weimar Republic. For many, Hirschfeld and his institute symbolized what they saw as Weimar's overly sexualized culture. Hirschfeld was also targeted because of his Jewish ancestry and his sexuality. This occurred even though he did not observe cultural Jewish or religious traditions and never made his private life part of his public persona. Hirschfeld even became the victim of violent right-wing assaults during the 1920s. In 1921, he was badly beaten in Munich. A newspaper article celebrated the assault and warned that the next time his skull might be crushed. In 1933, the Nazi regime began to crack down on what they saw as un-German ideas. Hirschfeld and the Institute for Sexual Science were subject to Nazi attacks on a number of fronts. The Nazis hated Hirschfeld for his pacifism, his Jewish ancestry, and his ideas about sex, gender, and sexuality. On May 6th, 1933, a Nazi student group marched to the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin. With members of the SA, they ransacked the institute and looted its library and archives. Days later, the stolen books, artifacts, and clinical files were destroyed in one of several public book burnings organized across Germany. A bust of Hirschfeld was paraded through the streets on a stick before being thrown onto the bonfire. Within months, Nazi authorities forced the Institute for Sexual Science to close.
Forward, a Jewish press, had this to say yesterday.
The Institute for Sexual Research was a groundbreaking clinic and place of support for trans, queer, and gender nonconforming people. It also housed a library of research on gender-affirming surgery and sexuality more generally. After the raid, the students piled the Institute's entire collection in the street and set fire to the books, destroying research that would not be recreated for decades. The book burning at the Institute for Sexual Research was one of the earliest and largest book burnings during Hitler's reign.
Out of everything in the discourse, no Holocaust historians deny or debate the destruction of Hirschfeld's work by the Nazis. It's not in contention. Throughout the upcoming tweets fired back and forth, the tense two-day debates, nobody denies this happened. Except for Joanne Rowling. Even the Nazis on Elon Musk's Twitter agree it happened. They just think it was, good that it happened because they're Nazis.
The Nazis burned books on trans healthcare and research. Why are you so desperate to uphold their ideology around gender?
How? How did you type this out and press send without thinking, I should maybe check my source for this because it might have been a fever dream?
The extremely, undeniably charitable read of this, and the only one that wouldn't end with Joanne being a Nazi crime denialist, is that she's completely ignorant to LGBTQ plus history. And this wouldn't surprise me. She's often incredibly ignorant to LGBTQ plus issues, despite speaking for and over the community frequently and with as much disdain for us as possible. I don't owe her that charity, but I won't say one way or another what goes on in her head. The only thing I know for sure is that at every turn, she seems willing to say or do anything she can to prevent anyone from having sympathy for trans people. If it was an error on her part, the ethical, reasonable thing to do would be to say, I was incorrect. I was not aware of the Nazi raids on Hirschfeld's Institute, which I condemn and apologize for referring to as possibly being a fever dream. But she didn't, and I believe that was for a very specific reason. To admit that the Nazis condemned and attacked an institution that served to help trans people and performed gender confirmation surgery, she'd be admitting that her and the Nazis are aligned ideologically, at least on this one point. Rowling frequently attacks institutions that do just that, even going as far as to call for those doctors to be put on trial and sent to prison, despite not having broken any laws. Twitter is a strange place. One minute, they're talking about how bringing chili to your neighbor is classist, and the next, George Takei is replying to J.K. Rowling's denial of Nazi crimes. I wish I knew how to log off. I don't know how to log off. George said, quite simply,
This is, in fact, true.
And in response to this, the man that Joanne would come to use as a source for her denials, Malcolm Clark of the anti-trans lobby group, the LGB Alliance, waded in Rowling's defense, of course. Throughout all of this, Malcolm refuses to acknowledge that Joanne was incorrect, likely due to his fear of her terrifying, vindictive responses and day-long rage sessions on Twitter where she targets individuals, leading to intense dog piles and harassment from her sycophants. Instead of addressing the actual, verifiable claim being made, the Nazis burned books on trans healthcare and research, he replies with an attack on Hirschfeld himself. That's right, he thought, I know how to prove that we're not aligned with Nazis. Attack the guy the Nazis attacked. This was the most reasonable defense of Joanne he could come up with at the time. There's this myth that people only use 10% of their brain, but that's not true. I contend that gender-critical people use none. Like the anti-Matilda. Seriously, a gender-critical woman who denied that the books were burned asked for the ISBN numbers of the books. The ISBN. A system introduced 40 years later. Okay, sorry, back to George. He replied to Rowling with,
This is, in fact, true.
To which Malcolm replied with this.
Hirschfeld, though Jewish and gay, was pro-eugenics, argued homosexuals should not reproduce, recommended gays for the stagnant cure involving castration, and tried to locate sperm cells in lesbians. His institute had a deeply racist and misogynist ethnology department. He was a quack.
Now, I'd like to clarify and to draw attention to the fact that Malcolm actually doesn't dispute outright that the Nazi crime took place, as Joanne did. And nothing Hirschfeld is accused of by Malcolm would make Joanne's tweet any less of a denial of a Nazi crime. But let's actually examine his claims anyways, because Joanne used them as a shield against criticism, linking back to this thread on Twitter that he posted.
Thread on the persistent claims about trans people and the Nazis.
The thread relies heavily on a recent book called Racism and the Making of Gay Rights in some of his claims. Today, Malcolm sent this tweet to me.
If you were able to give me a single example from my thread of an error, you do it. You don't because you can't. Instead, you rant, indulge in bizarre hyperbole, and resort to projection. You are almost a test case in LGBTQ plus activism's infertile inability to debate. Toddle off.
Okay, Grandpa, let's get into it. But can you stop tensing your muscles to look more manly for the camera and maybe put a shirt on first?
In a book last year, Lori Mayer Hoover revealed Hirschfeld argued homosexuality was nature's way to prevent bad genes being passed on. Gays must not procreate, he said. Unwittingly, Hirschfeld gave credence to the Nazi conviction that gays were a threat to racial purity.
Neither my researcher/fact checker nor I could find a source for this claim through a detailed search of this book. The word genes did not appear in any of the text referring to gay people. Gays must not procreate as a phrase does not appear in the book at all. In fact, the word procreate does not appear in the book at all. It's of course possible that it is said in other ways, but definitely not in the way Malcolm represented it here. At the very least, Malcolm is being incredibly loose and sloppy with his phrasing. I'll have to wait for Malcolm's sources on these claims because he doesn't actually provide them in the thread, the one Joanne linked to. The book does say this, however, about Hirschfeld.
Magnus Hirschfeld was a sexologist, a scientist of human sexuality. He was also the world's best-known, most committed defender of homosexuals.
Hirschfeld was one of the first to propose scientifically that being gay was a matter of biology.
And he helped found the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, partially in outraged response to the trial of Oscar Wilde 2 years earlier in England on 25 charges of gross indecency related to his homosexual relationships. Is now thought to be the first ever advocacy group for LGBTQ rights.
Hirschfeld was gay himself, having had a relationship with his protege, Li Shutong, who, it must be noted, was 40 years younger than Hirschfeld. Hirschfeld believed that there were 43,046,721 different types of human sexuality. I don't know how he counted that.
Love is as varied as people are,
he once said. An interview with Meyerhofer in Extra reveals what the actual author thought of Hirschfeld himself, going to great lengths to criticize Hirschfeld's racism, of which there is plenty of evidence for. Hirschfeld was by all accounts a mild supporter of eugenics. For more on this, you can watch Drop the Tea, a documentary on this channel that I created with Sarah from The Leftist Cooks. In the interview with Extra, the author says,
"With Hirschfeld, when I started out, I didn't have a good sense of who he was as a person. I think by the end of it, I did. I felt like he was a well-rounded person, and I could see many sides of him and still admire things about him. But I wouldn't need to meet him in the afterlife or anything."
According to the author, Hirschfeld was specifically racist against black people. Hirschfeld called himself an anti-racist, but that term meant something different back then. There is ample evidence that he was racist, but was against scientific racism. Hirschfeld criticized some parts of eugenics theory while supporting others. He did argue in favor of sterilizing the feeble-minded, as Malcolm Clark claims, but there's no indication that he included gay people in that category. His history is also complicated. According to the Washington Post, he joined the feminist organization League for the Protection of Mothers and campaigned for the decriminalization of abortion and an end to the rules that impose celibacy and non-maternity on female teachers and civil servants. But he also believed that women were inferior to men. Suffice it to say, he had some problematic ideas. Clark claimed that Hirschfeld's research was obsessed with sperm. And if he was, it was not in the way Clark implies. Hirschfeld suggested examining lesbians' vaginal secretions for sperm and the urine of gay men for menstrual blood. This appears to have happened because Hirschfeld failed to distinguish between gays and lesbians and transsexuals of the day, something that goes against Malcolm's claims that gay people and trans people were not in any way conflated by the Nazis. All indications are that Hirschfeld did not advocate for sterilizing gay people and worked extensively to overturn the Weimar Republic's paragraph 175 criminalizing homosexuality. It seems that the intention of this thread is to do one thing: to link Hirschfeld's research to modern-day gender-critical arguments that transition care is designed to sterilize cisgender gay people. That is the overall implication of this thread, and it's something Joanne has claimed as well.
Perhaps your time would be better spent thinking up some reasons you cheered on the sterilization of gay and artistic kids. One of your co-religionists is probably working on a slogan right now. We all look forward to seeing it.
In his thread, Malcolm also goes on to talk about Hirschfeld's colleague, Erwin Gorbrandt, who invented the modern vaginoplasty procedure that forms the basis for how the procedure is still performed today. Clark claims that Gorbrandt led the Nazi sterilization effort, but we found no evidence that he was ever involved in sterilizations. I will carefully add that this does not mean he was not involved at all, just that there's no evidence anywhere in Malcolm's thread, or on the internet that I could find. All mentions of Gorbrandt leading Nazi efforts at sterilization originate with Clark's tweets over the years. He does not appear in an academic list of Nazi doctor war criminals that includes many that ran the Nazi sterilization regime. It was Heinrich Himmler who oversaw the Nazi sterilization program, and Dr. Philipp Buhler was the early leader. Gorbrandt's horrific experimentations at Dachau did not involve sterilization. Instead, they were on hypothermia, as Clark himself says. But this too is a contradiction in Clark's argument. If he supposedly led the Nazi sterilization effort, why was he researching hypothermia during the war? So that's Rowling's defense. That this man, who definitely researched trans medicine and absolutely had that research burned, had some really bad opinions. But so does she. And if all of her books were burned, her opinions wouldn't change that fact. Shortly after Joanne's initial tweet took off, Alejandra, username at @square_ on Twitter, replied,
"You're engaging in Holocaust denial, Joanne,"
with several sources. In response, Rowling attempted to not only move the goalposts, but relocate them to an entirely different stadium.
Neither of your articles support the contention that trans people were the first victims of the Nazis, or that all research on trans healthcare was burned in 1930s Germany. You are engaging in lying, Alejandra.
Now, if we look at the original tweet Rowling claimed was possibly a fever dream, there's no mention of trans people being the first victims of the Nazis. This is a straw man, also a Mott and Bailey fallacy, which is something Alejandra quickly points out.
"I know reading is hard, but where did anyone say they were the first victims or that they burned all books? The facts are that trans people were targeted and the Hirschfeld Sex Institute was sacked by the Nazis and its contents burned on May 6th, 1933.
To which Joanne, the uber anti-Matilda, replies with a screenshot from a completely different account made after Joanne's original tweet.
You're not knowing that trans people were the Nazis' first targets does not make telling you about it a fever dream. We lost basically all research on trans health because the Nazis burnt it all down.
Now, it seems that this tweet is referring, again, specifically to the book burnings being discussed, as the campaign of Nazi book burnings pretty much began with the attack on Hirschfeld's Institute, and Dora Richter, the first transgender woman known to have undergone sex reassignment surgery, which was done by doctors at the Institute, may have been killed during the attack.
In May 1933, some 4 months after Hitler came to power, a mob made up of right-wing students and possibly SS stormed to the Institute. They seized all Magnus Hirschfeld's records and ransacked the buildings. Hirschfeld had already fled the Nazi terror and was living in France. But Dora was still there and was never heard from again. It is presumed she was killed in the attack, although it is possible she was arrested and died in custody. It's not known just how many people were murdered after the Institute's records fell into the hands of the Gestapo and the police.
So yes, claiming that the Nazis first targeted trans people in the series of book burnings, pretty much true. But regardless, that has nothing to do with Joanne's original assertion she continually tries to distract us from, that these book burnings, and possibly the death of Dora Richter, never happened. The pivot in claims may have come from tweets in Rowling's mentions about a recent libel-related court case in Germany over an academic accused of denying Nazi crimes by denying that Nazis targeted trans people. Malcolm Clark pointed to court documents from an appeals court decision translated into English that appeared to say that trans people were not the primary or first victims of the Nazis, though again, this has no relation to the initial claim and isn't a widely held view among trans people or academics. Malcolm, of course, found his way into my refutations of Rowling's attempts to pivot and use his thread as a source, but when asked directly multiple times if Rowling was incorrect about the book burnings, he failed to respond over and over, but eventually gave in and claimed that what was a fever dream was
the claim that criticizing Hirschfeld is somehow to uphold Nazi ideology around gender.
Of course, this is patently ridiculous. The original tweet Rowling quoted didn't mention Hirschfeld at all. No criticism of Hirschfeld was made or discussed. And how would she be asking for a source on someone's opinion on what it means to criticize Hirschfeld? It was a weak attempt at deflection, one that even he didn't try and defend again. And also, that was not something Rowling herself ever claimed. If there's one thing Malcolm Clark loves, it's sourceless claims and amateur obfuscation. Much of the discourse eventually led to one contentious debate. Did the Nazis target trans people at all? Joanne seems to think they didn't.
Please do that. I am very fed up being accused of the same thing, just because I have the temerity to state that a thing didn't happen, i.e., the suggestion that trans people were targeted for extermination based on Irene Trans did not happen. I know the facts and reality are an alien concept to this particular faction, but at some point, enough has to be enough. The truth does matter.
There's no tragedy where they didn't suffer more than anyone else. No issue in which they don't center themselves, language, history, and other people's oppression. All must be reconfigured around them.
Much of the argument here is that trans people may have been targeted, but only if they were gay or Jewish as well, and never actually due to being trans. This is untrue. In response to this claim circulating and being circulated by Joanne to her approximately 14.88 million followers, Eli Ehrlich created a website that explains exactly this. Much of what I'm referencing came from this site. So, did the Nazis specifically target trans people? According to literally Auschwitz.org, the site run by the Auschwitz Museum and Memorial.
Until 1933, Rome's brown shirts attacked gay bars throughout the country. Many were closed down and the rest forced to operate illegally. At a meeting of municipal administration officials in Hamburg on November 13th, 1933, for instance, the chief of police was ordered to pay particular attention to transvestites and send them to concentration camps.
The U.S. Holocaust Memorial and Museum had this to say.
By the 1920s, large German cities like Berlin and Hamburg became known for their open, tolerant atmosphere and nightlife. Dozens of different bars and nightclubs welcomed a wide range of different groups, including gay men, lesbian women, and transgender people, who were often referred to at the time as transvestites. An advertisement for Violetta Ladies Club shows how these clubs helped form a shared sense of group identity among these communities.
Remember the case I mentioned earlier? It was the academic accused of denying Nazi war crimes by denying that the Nazis targeted trans people. This is from the written testimony of Lori from that case, which details that this topic isn't as black and white as gender-critical anti-trans activists like Joanne and Malcolm would have you believe.
The first scholarly publications on transgender people under National Socialism argued that they were not persecuted. To be more specific, one foundational essay argued that they were not persecuted, and another argued that some trans women were, but only insofar as officials mistakenly believed them to be cisgender gay men. This, however, is not accurate. Newer research shows a more complex and more violent situation. The newer scholarship also makes the case that racial status and other factors mattered when trans people ran into trouble with the Nazi state. Trans people were at risk. The risk they ran varied according to other things in their lives. Not all trans people suffered violence, yet there is a pattern of state hostility and police harassment of trans people, particularly trans women. In some cases, it ended in murder. Often, when one sees the term persecution in the context of the Nazi state, one thinks foremost of the persecution of Jewish Europeans. The Nazi state systematically rounded up whole communities of Jews and Roma, gay as well as straight, cisgender as well as transgender, deported them and murdered them. This did not happen to Aryans. It did not happen to Aryans even if they were accused of crimes having to do with sex and gender, such as male-male sex or public indecency, a charge made against trans people. Without ever losing sight of the Holocaust, we should, however, allow that a group could be persecuted even if its members did not face highly organized violence like what Jews and Roma faced.
So, for example, we correctly recognize gay men, regardless of racial designation, as a persecuted group. We do so despite the fact that Nazi authorities treated Aryan gay men and Jewish gay men in very different ways. Aryan men accused of breaking paragraph 175 could usually retain a lawyer. They often had a trial before a judge. They were not always found guilty. Most men convicted under paragraph 175 served their sentences in prisons, not concentration camps. Some were murdered in the camp system. Some were sent to the camps without trial. That did not happen in all cases. The majority of approximately 50,000 men convicted under paragraph 175 in the Nazi period were Aryans who survived the Nazi regime. Like Aryan gay men, if trans people had Aryan status, they were not subjected to a systematic roundup such as what the Nazi state carried out against German Jews. They did, however, face state hostility, harassment, and violence because they were transgender. Nazi officials generally had negative views of transgender people. In what may be the only Nazi-era book on the topic, the 1938 Ein Beitrag zum Problem des Transvestitismus, Hermann Ferdinand Voss writes, "Their asocial mindset, which is often paired with criminal activity, justifies draconian measures by the state." Prior to the Nazi seizure of power, not enough could be done about trans people, he wrote, but happily now, there is a possibility of putting the people in question in protective custody or possibly having them castrated or via temporary appropriate detention to impress upon them that they must put their inclination on hold.
Based on this police report, Fritz Kitzing was repeatedly arrested in Germany for being a transvestite, which is now understood to be a trans person under modern language. They were confined to prison and then a labor camp before escaping to England, where they were arrested for cross-dressing again, and deported to Germany, where they were arrested again.
The report from that last arrest is described by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum as follows. The report requests that Kitzing be confined to a concentration camp, but it also states plainly that there was no proof that Kitzing was guilty of committing any crimes. Instead, the report attacks Kitzing as a social threat to the Nazi regime's imagined national community. It states that a concentration camp was necessary because K is an untruthful and depraved transvestite of the worst kind. This document shows that the authorities did not imprison Kitzing to uphold the law. The report recommends a concentration camp even after concluding that K could not be proven to have committed an illegal act. Why would authorities still target Kitzing if no laws have been broken? Kitzing was sent to the Sachsenhausen camp later that year. After being transferred briefly to Gestapo custody in Berlin in 1937, Kitzing was released. After more than a year in custody with no evidence of a crime. A few days later, Kitzing was permitted to collect 2 suitcases of women's clothing confiscated by the Gestapo. In March 1938, Kitzing was arrested again for blackmail. Police quickly established that Kitzing had not been involved in any way. However, searches of Kitzing's apartment turned up letters written to friends in England about conditions in the Nazi camp system. Kitzing was taken into custody for spreading so-called atrocity propaganda against Nazi Germany. No further records exist, and Kitzing's fate is unknown.
Trans people were targeted by the Nazis for being trans, just like gay people were targeted by the Nazis for being gay. Gay men obviously weren't called gay in Germany at the time, but Joanne seems to have no issue saying the Nazis targeted gay people. Transgender people weren't called transgender at the time, but it seems Joanne does think that's a reasonable argument to say that trans people weren't targeted. While Aryan LGBTQ+ people had a different kind of horrible and unconscionable persecution by the Nazis, that does not make it unhorrific. It does not mean it did not happen. It does not mean that denying that it happened isn't a denial of Nazi crimes. It does not mean it isn't anti-Semitic, homophobic, transphobic, and fucking dangerous. Rowling has been accused of anti-Semitism before. Her depictions of goblins in her Harry Potter series have widely been panned as anti-Semitic caricatures. I discussed the ties to anti-Semitism in my 3-part series, Gender Critical, which discusses my time undercover in their private anti-trans Facebook groups. What happened this week served to show to everyone what LGBTQ+ advocates have been saying for years. There is no level that Joanne won't stoop to in order to attack the community. If denying Nazi war crimes helps her movement, she'll do it in a heartbeat. Joanne may have denied Nazi war crimes, but she isn't a Holocaust denier. She admits the Holocaust happened, but she is engaging in what's called soft denial, or Holocaust distortion, or Holocaust revisionism. These terms are important distinctions that allow historians and academics specificity in discussing these denials and revisionisms.
Holocaust revisionism falls into this category of pseudo-history, whose purpose is the denial of the past for present political or ideological reasons.
The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance has a few examples of what constitute Holocaust distortion. The one applicable here would be intentional efforts to excuse or minimize the impact of the Holocaust or its principal elements. This is what the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust says about soft denial.
Broadly speaking, Holocaust denial is any attempt to deny the Holocaust happened. Holocaust distortion, sometimes referred to as soft denial or Holocaust revisionism, is where the Holocaust is acknowledged to have happened, but where the extent or nature of the Holocaust is questioned, minimized, or trivialized. It is important to note with these definitions that Holocaust distortion can, of course, lead to denial, particularly when the uniqueness of the Holocaust is questioned, or when facts are distorted so grossly that the reality of the Holocaust is denied.
In response to her Holocaust distortion, or soft Holocaust denial, Joanne's sycophants have been coming to her defense. One claimed Holocaust denier was the latest slur to silence women. People in her replies were saying things such as,
"All this proves is A, the Jews are behind trans surgery and always have been, and B, the Nazis weren't the bad guys."
In replies to trans woman Katie Montgomery, there were varied opinions on it, like,
"We're at the you're a Nazi stage of online tedium now.
We need more camps."
And
the Nazis were right for banning transsexual filth.
I hope Joanne eventually does the right thing instead of just liking posts from far-right Trump supporters who agree with her. I hope she admits she denied a Nazi crime and stops speaking over and for LGBTQ+ people. But I also hope I win the lottery. Not sure which is more likely at this point, but I'm likely dying poor. I'll leave this with a particularly apt and ironic quote by Joanne herself. One that describes her perfectly.
People who believe themselves possessed with almost saint-like righteousness are capable of blocking out almost any evidence that contradicts their worldview.
I can't say for certain until this video is live, but I'm sure all the discussion of Nazis and the Holocaust will have left this video buried by the YouTube algorithm and with limited to no ad revenue. So if you want to support my work and help me cover the cost of hiring this fact checker, it would mean the world to me if you could give this video a like, comment, and share after you subscribe, and join my Patreon for these videos ad and sponsor free, as well as extra videos I've enlisted from my public channel, and benefits like watch parties and getting your name in the credits, or hiding an item on my CGI sets. Yeah, or just helping me, please. I also have a second channel, Respect the Dead, the channel where we don't. It's a bi-weekly video podcast where we pick a terrible person from history and vent about them in a way that will make you realize that bullying is sometimes fine, usually if you're bullying the dead. We even have a special episode on the death of J.K. Rowling's career. So if you're interested in a comedic retelling of her ridiculous and horrific descent into transphobia, check it out. The link will be in the description below. It is midnight. It is the next day, and I've been working on this all day, so I'm going to go to bed. Love you. Bash back.